for much of my life, I've not been a Christian. My father was Jewish by race, agnostic really by conviction. My mother was not a churchgoer. So growing up, I was not a churchgoer, and I became really an atheist. And I found the whole subject really of Christianity and religion very boring. I wasn't interested in it, and I just thought it was completely irrelevant to my life. My first year at university, I was sharing rooms with a guy called Nicky Lee. And I'd said to Nicky, because I'd kind of come across Christians in my year off, and I was deeply suspicious. I never understood why they smiled so much. And I said to Nicky, whatever you do, don't let them in your room. But I was too late, because he came back, he and his then girlfriend, now his wife, Scylla, and they told me that they had become Christians. And I was horrified. I mean, they were such lovely people. And I thought, what's happened? They've joined some cult. I better help them. But I thought, I don't really know how to help them because I know nothing about it. So I better read up on the subject. I better read up on philosophy and religion. The only thing that I could find, because it was quite late at night, the only thing that I could find in my room was an old Bible I'd had for RE at school. So that night I started reading it. And I read all the way through Matthew's Gospel, all the way through Mark, all the way through Luke. I got about halfway through John's Gospel when I fell asleep. And the following morning I carried on reading. I read all that day, all the next day, all the next day. I was a student, I didn't have any work to do. And when I got to the end of the New Testament, I came to the conclusion, it's true. And what I want to look at tonight is why. What is the evidence? I don't believe that you can prove Christianity kind of like a mathematical proof, or a scientific proof, or even a philosophical proof. But it's based on evidence. It's more like historical evidence, more like the kind of evidence in a legal case you might put before a jury. I spent 10 years studying law and practicing as a barrister, so for me personally, evidence is very important. I don't think I could just take a kind of blind leap of faith. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Sometimes people say, but hang on a second, I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? That's what I believed. I thought, because I was an atheist, there was no point in even looking at who Jesus was. But for a reason I'll come to later on, I found that it's actually through the life, death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus, that I came to believe that there is a God. So what is the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? The answer is that there's a great deal of evidence. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. Some say, well, the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially, the more manuscripts we have and the earlier they are, the less doubt there is about the original. So, let's compare other ancient texts. You'll see there in the manual various other historical texts. So, for example, you'll see Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy that we have is AD 900. there's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap, we have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. When it comes to the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130, and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, and 9,300 others. So, one of the greatest textual critics ever, F.J.A. Hort, said this: "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings." And no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So, we know from evidence outside and inside the New Testament that he existed, but who is he? We know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. Many today would say, okay, he was a human being, but only a human being. Albeit, maybe he was a great religious teacher. So, for example, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code suggests Jesus was not the Son of God. He was a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man of staggering influence, a great religious teacher, but not the Son of God. On the other hand, Bono, lead singer of U2, says this: "I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I do believe it, odd as it sounds." So that's the issue. What evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Would you like to turn to Matthew chapter 16, verse 13? When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Son of Man was Jesus' favourite way of referring to himself. "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." In other words, people are saying, "You're a great religious teacher." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's possible to be with someone for a long time and not realize who they are. I love playing squash, and I play squash pretty regularly, but at the squash club that I belong to, there's also a gym, and sometimes if there's no one to play squash with, I go into the gym. Some time ago, I went into the gym and I was doing some weights there, and there was a great big guy who actually I didn't realize who he was. His name is Paul Ackford. He was an England rugby international, ex-policeman, weighs about 230 pounds, and I was doing weights with him. He was lifting huge weights. I was lifting puny little weights. But afterwards, we were chatting in the changing rooms upstairs, and I was trying to make polite conversation. So I said, "Do you do any other sport?" I meant apart from weightlifting. I think he assumed that I must know that he played rugby, so he said, "Yeah," he said, "I play a bit of squash." So I said, "Oh, is squash your main sport?" He said, "No," he said, "I play rugby." So I said, "Oh, really? Do you play for a club?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Harlequins." So I said, "Oh, Harlequins, I've heard of them. They're rather good, aren't they?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Don't they have some England players playing for them?" He said, "Yeah, 5. So I said, "Have you ever played for England?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "When did you last play for England?" He said, 2 weeks ago in the World Cup. And I looked at him, I said, "You're Paul Ackford." I'd been with him all that time, and I hadn't realized who he was. And the disciples looked at Jesus and they said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now the question is, were they right? What is the evidence? There are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was anything more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that's the end of the argument. And some people say Jesus never claimed to be God. And it's true, he didn't go around with a T-shirt saying, "I am God." But when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. So that's the first part of the argument. Secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So let's look at the first part of the argument. What did he say about himself? And there are three pieces of evidence. First of all, his teaching centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, "Don't look at me, look at God." Jesus, who was the most humble and self-effacing person who ever lived, in pointing people to God, pointed to himself. I think most people recognize, don't they, that materialism can in itself never satisfy. And people are looking for some kind of spiritual reality. Jesus said, "I'm the way." People are looking for values on which to base their lives. Jesus said, "I'm the truth." I think all of us want some ultimate meaning, purpose to our lives. Jesus said, "I'm the life." Second piece of evidence is a kind of indirect piece of evidence. Jesus said a number of things which, although they weren't direct claims to be God, show that he regarded himself as being in the same position as God. Take one example. Jesus said to people, "Your sins are forgiven." To forgive those who've sinned against us is something that we can all do. But to forgive those who've sinned against others is something only God can do. Third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, God made flesh. It seems to me, there are a whole variety of possibilities, but they basically boil down to three. The first is that it wasn't true, and that he knew it was untrue, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and an evil one at that. Second possibility is it was not true, but he really didn't realize it. He genuinely thought he was God, in which case he was deluded. I think we'd say he was insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. So what evidence is there to support what he said? Well, I guess one area you might look at, first area you might look at, what did he teach? The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching that's ever fallen from the lips of a human being. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. Then, what about his lifestyle? What about the things that he did? Jesus must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, "Oh, Christianity is boring." Certainly wouldn't have been boring being with Jesus. Imagine how wonderful it would be to go, say, hospital visiting with Jesus. And one time he went into a hospital and there was a man in there who'd been an invalid for 38 years. And he said, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And the man walked out of the hospital, healed. Imagine going on a picnic with Jesus. Don't bring any food. Come as you are. Not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless, his love for people who society had written off, the outcasts, and the way he set people free and still sets people free today. And of course, I suppose, ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends.
Nicky goes on to the third and fourth pieces of evidence: Jesus' character and his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Fifth piece of evidence, and by far the most important, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. So what evidence is there that the resurrection really happened? Let me summarize under four main headings. First of all, his absence from the tomb. First, it's been suggested that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and he recovered in some way in the cool of the tomb. But if any of you have seen Mel Gibson's film The Passion, you know that what it means to undergo a Roman flogging and crucifixion. People didn't survive that. Furthermore, there's a fascinating piece of evidence. Would you like to turn to John chapter 19, verse 33? But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. That breaking legs was to speed up death by crucifixion. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. It appears that there had been a separation of the clot and the serum, which we now know is good medical evidence that he was dead. But they didn't have that medical evidence at the time. They were simply writing it because that's what happened. Other people say, well, maybe robbers stole the body. That's the least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body was absent. When the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing that for robbers to take. They had collapsed, like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterflies emerged. And when they saw that, they believed. Second piece of evidence. First, the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb. Secondly, his presence with the disciples. He was seen. Sometimes people say, well, hallucination. Yeah, people do hallucinate, but it is highly unlikely that even two people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at one time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then, third piece of evidence is the immediate impact. Here were a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that totally changed them, so that they went around telling everybody, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there's this explosion in 300 years right across the whole known world. It's a story of a peaceful revolution with no parallel, really, in the history of the world. Fourth piece of evidence is Christian experience down the ages. Countless millions of people down the ages have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, continent, nationality, every economic, social, intellectual background from all walks of life. They unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. Millions of Christians all around the world today experiencing this relationship. I told you at the beginning that I, through reading the New Testament, I came to the conclusion it's true. But I didn't want to become a Christian. I thought if I become a Christian, my life will be miserable from now on. And I tried to put it off. I tried to find ways not to become a Christian, but eventually I just said yes. And at that moment, I experienced, I think, what unconsciously I'd been searching for all my life. I experienced something that gave ultimate meaning and purpose to life in a relationship with Jesus. And that was the last place in the world I expected to find it. It was at that moment it kind of dropped from my head to my heart. Sherlock Holmes said this. He said, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And I suppose what I've been trying to argue tonight is that when you look at the claims of Jesus, who he said he was, and the possibilities of him being evil or deluded, I think we can rule them out as being impossible. When you look at his teaching, his life, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, those explanations become, to say that he was evil or deluded is kind of absurd, it's illogical. C.S. Lewis put it like this. He said, we're faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we're talking about was and is just what he said, or else insane or something worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God.